you're up for an award soon, an important award.
Yeah, it's called the AFIM, American Federation of Independent Music. It's the sort of Grammy Awards of the independent record label world. And I'm up for Best Pop Album.
Excellent.
And I'm actually going to, the awards are in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to perform there as well. So that'll be cool.
Fantastic. And who's your competition there?
You know, I honestly can't remember all. I remember that Vonda Shepard was one. I don't remember who the other ones were. There were a couple who I'd never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
So I just remember Vonda Shepard, who I certainly have heard of because she's famous.
Yeah, well, we'll all be keeping our fingers crossed down here for you.
Oh, thank you.
Growing up, did you have any formal music training at all?
I took piano lessons probably from like first grade to, I don't know, fifth grade, and probably practiced for a total of like 6 hours the entire 5 years. So I learned to read music, but I never really became proficient on the piano, not by lessons anyway. I did take some guitar lessons when I was around 12, and then when I was around 17, but again, didn't really work so hard on it. Mostly what I do on the piano and on the guitar is pretty well self-taught, and it's all pretty simple.
At what point did your love for music really start to take hold?
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I've been sort of performing and singing for people since I was around 10 years old. So probably around then. I mean, it's been a long time. I wanted to be a professional starting around age 16 when I was performing in my high school, and people really thought I was good. And that's like probably when I started to think about actually doing it professionally.
Was there any particular artist or recording that turned you towards the style of music that you pursue today?
Yeah, there really was. The very first and most important was Joni Mitchell's album Blue, which my older brother, turned me on to when I was 15. And that really changed my life. I mean, I started playing guitar like her, learning her tunings, trying to write like her. I mean, what I wrote was unbelievably bad, but, trying to sing like her, and that absolutely put me on sort of the path I've been on ever since.
Yeah, look, I'm sure you weren't the only one affected by that album.
I know. Every time I tell that to somebody, people say, yeah, that's what a lot of women say that was the album.
Mm-hmm. Now, you left for New York at a young age. Was the pull for you to relocate there a strong one?
Well, what happened was I was living in Chicago, and I had met this guy, and we started singing together in Chicago folk clubs. And actually, we formed a little group with a couple other people called Steps in Flight, which is the most nauseating, like 70s name, which is actually from a Jackson Browne song. And then there was a big article in the New York Times about a folk revival in Greenwich Village. And we saw the article, and he decided, let's go to New York. I was actually very passive about most things back then, so I said, okay. But if he hadn't said that, I probably would never have come to New York. So the pull was certainly that there was a very important folk scene going on in New York, but the pull was also that this guy, my boyfriend, was saying, let's go there.
It's well documented that Sean Colvin was an early musical colleague of yours. I believe you worked as a duo for a while.
Yes, we met in '81 in the Greenwich Village folk scene, and I guess I don't remember it very well, but we obviously became mutual fans pretty quickly and started sitting in on each other's gigs, and that kind of evolved into doing gigs together as a duo, mostly sort of parties, weddings, that kind of thing, playing country music, and then we started to get a few real gigs, where we were playing more of our own stuff. And actually the way that ended was, let's see, I need to back up a little bit. Sometime in there, I had decided I didn't want to be a singer anymore. But you wouldn't have known that by the way I was acting. I was still singing, and I had gone back to college, but I was still singing. And so we did a gig, Sean and I did, at this place, Folk City, which was sort of the hub of the village folk scene and was a very important place. And a record company came up to us after the show and said, "You guys are great. We'd love to record you." And I didn't miss a beat. And I said, no, I don't want to make a record. I'm going to be a psychotherapist. And I remember Sean looking at me really in shock because the way I had been acting was that I was serious about music. And I think she said something like, "Well, Lucy, if you don't want to pursue this, then, I really need to." And that was the end of kind of seriously performing together. Although we did keep performing together, but not in any serious way. It was mostly just sort of side gigs. Then there's the whole story of why did I decide not to be a singer, but I was still singing? And I don't know if you want me to get into that now.
No, go ahead.
Right. I decided one afternoon after I had been singing for about 3 years in the village, and it was really going well. I'd gotten this really great review in the New York Times when I was 21 years old. Everything was sort of going the way it's supposed to go, and then I just decided I didn't want to do it anymore. I think at the time I knew I was really unhappy, and I figured I was unhappy because I didn't want to be a singer. But many years later, and I decided that day to go back to college. The thing was, I kept singing. I kept singing with Sean. I kept doing backup vocals on people's records. Some of the biggest gigs I ever had, recording-wise, were after I had, quote, quit, like with Nancy Griffith and Suzanne Vega. So I was still singing, but I had told everyone and myself that I wasn't serious about it. Then I ended up going to graduate school in psychology and really did kind of drop out for quite a few years. But it was during that time when I was in graduate school, Sean and I had stayed friends, and she had this idea that she wanted to produce a record. She never produced. And why don't we make a record together? I'd be the singer, she'd be the producer. And I said, sure, but I wasn't serious about it. It was sort of like a lark. Although it was pointed out to me later that if I really didn't want to be a singer, I would never have made a record. Obviously, I was very conflicted. So we made the record. It turned out to be my first record, The Tide. And when I started shopping it to record companies, it was in that process that I started seeing a new therapist myself, because I knew something was really wrong with me. I knew I was really not happy, and I should be happy. I was already a psychologist at that point. I was happily married. And what became clear one day, not long after I started seeing this new therapist, was that I had been lying to myself. The way it came about was my therapist asked me, no, I was telling him something like, well, I wouldn't want what Sean has. This is my memory of what happened. Yeah. I wouldn't want what Sean has, meaning money, recognition, fame, all kinds of success. And he asked me something that I don't remember anyone else ever asking me, which was, why not? And I stopped dead in my tracks, and I didn't have an answer. And it was literally that moment when I started to realize that I'd been lying to myself, which was a pretty life-changing moment, that I had always wanted what Sean had, and I'd always wanted to be a singer, and that I was actually running away from it all those years. As my therapist later said to me, psychology was a consolation prize because I wouldn't let myself have first prize. From that moment on, basically, which was about 6 years ago, I went back to music really seriously, and eventually had to give up psychology altogether because things started to go too well with music and I was too busy. So that's sort of the long story made relatively short.
Hindsight, do you think that period of uncertainty was something you needed to go through to get to where you are now?
It's a funny thing. I'm asked that all the time, and I guess the truth is that there's no path possible but the one you're on. I couldn't have done what I'm doing now back then because I was too conflicted, I was too passive, I was too sort of strangled by my own conflicts. I think the only way I could do it was to go through what I went through. if I had seen a therapist who could have helped me years before, maybe it would have happened earlier, but I didn't, and it only seemed to be able to happen the way it happened. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Okay.
Tell us about your dad's background in music. He's involved in music too, isn't he?
Yeah, not professionally. He's a mathematician, actually retired now, but he's always played music, and he was professional as a piano player when he was in graduate school. He played in, swing bands. I mean, this was the 1940s. And he's been involved in music ever since. When he was at the University of Chicago, he was the rehearsal piano player for the University of Chicago Gilbert and Sullivan Company.
Wow.
So he would always play. He always played for all of their rehearsals. So I learned lots of Gilbert and Sullivan growing up. And he was just always playing for fun and playing at parties and that kind of thing, but not really professionally.
As you've progressed through your albums, there's been an increasing number of original songs in relation to covers. Is that because you've become more a prolific writer over time, or have you just had a greater confidence in your material?
No, it's because I've been more prolific. I didn't do original songs, like, for instance, on my first album, because I didn't have any. So it's really just been that I've started to write, and that's why there's more original songs in my repertoire.
A bit about your writing. Is there a certain frame of mind you need to be in before you can sit down and write?
Funny you should say that, because just before you called, I was trying to write. No. I've learned that I better not wait to be inspired or be in the mood, because then I'll never do it. So what I do, and I learned this kind of from John Gorka. You know John Gorka?
Yeah, sure.
His music?
Yeah.
He really looks at it as, a craft. You sit down and you work at it. So what I do is, no matter what I'm feeling, I try to make myself sit down and do it as often as possible. And that's the way songs get written for me. Now, I know there are other people, like Greg Brown. I think he just does it totally because he's inspired to do it at that moment. But that just doesn't work for me.
Do you have songs that carry around with you for a while before you actually do sit down and put them on paper?
If I'm carrying them around, I'm not aware of it. I wouldn't be surprised if unconsciously I carry stuff around, because stuff just kind of comes out every now and then that you don't know where it came from. It must have been in there for a while. But I'm not aware of it. I write things down as I'm aware of them.
In your recording experience to date, have you found that the finished recorded product of a song can vary much from how you originally envisaged it would sound?
No. I mean, I'm happy to say that the finished product is exactly what I wanted, especially with this last album. Now, did I envision it that way? Like the song, for instance, I don't know how well you know the record, but the last song on the record, which is like this mega electric guitar thing called The Child's Hand, I would never have envisioned it that way. And my producer said, I hear this with electric guitar. And I was really nervous about it, because I was really afraid with this album of alienating sort of the folk world, because it was becoming so sort of rock and electric. And he said, "Lucy, trust me." And he was so right. Now, so did I envision it that way? No. Was it exactly what I wanted? Yes. And that's really the way the whole album came out. I wouldn't change one thing on the entire album, and I've never felt that before.
I have a theory on why there's been such an influx of women singer-songwriters in recent times. There really has been a flood of them coming through.
Yeah, I really don't. I mean, the only thing I can think of, I doubt that there's any more women singer-songwriters than there's ever been. There are just more of them with a higher profile.
Yeah.
And I would guess that it's simply like, everybody, like all the record companies jumped on, the grunge thing, because it was hip, and I think the record companies have just jumped on the idea of women and made more of them famous. I think that's what it is.
Talk about the Cry, Cry, Cry project. How did that all come together originally?
It was actually, Richard and Dara and I had known each other for a while. Richard and I had actually sung together a lot. We'd done a lot of shows together. We'd sung on each other's albums. Dara and I had sung together a bit at a couple of shows, and I'd sung on a couple of her records. And Dara and Richard had sung together a lot. They'd been on tour together, and they were on tour and were sort of singing, this is my understanding of it, they were singing cover songs at sound checks just for fun, and they were really enjoying it. And they had this idea one day, why don't we make an album of songs we love, just for fun? I guess they called their manager, who ended up being Cry Cry Cry's manager, Charlie Hunter, and I think someone suggested calling me, like, let's make it a trio. And Charlie called me, and I said, sure, I'm interested, but I never thought it would happen. And then I guess Charlie said to them, look, if you're going to do this, don't just make a little album to sell off the stage. Why don't you do it right and get a record deal and do a tour? And that's how it happened.
What criteria did you use when choosing the songs for the album?
We basically, we all had to love them. They had to be conducive to harmony. There were a few songs we loved that really were not songs you could put much harmony on. We tried to do songs that hadn't been covered before. The idea being, let's introduce people to some artists they may not know or to some songs they may not know. Those were the main criteria.
I thought one thing that really stood out on the album was your knack of singing harmony. Did you have a love for harmony singing right back to when you first got interested in music?
Yeah, I always loved singing harmony. I have a very distinct memory of, maybe I was 14, 15. I had a little tape recorder, and I would record myself singing, and then I'd play it back so that I could sing harmony with myself. And I just always loved singing harmony. And pretty much throughout my career, I've sung harmony with just a whole variety of people. And it's one of my favorite things to do.
What would be the golden rule of good harmony singing?
I don't know if there is a golden rule. Certainly one is listen. Make what you're doing really fit with what they're doing. And I think a lot of people who aren't great harmony singers don't understand that. I guess the other thing, and I heard Emmylou Harris say this, that harmony is really like another melody. And I've always sort of been kind of experimental and loose with what I consider to be harmony. So in other words, I won't just sing a parallel part. I won't be interested in doing that. I'll try and do something more interesting and different and experimental and adventurous than that.
Live shows that the three of you did must have been a lot of fun. How were they structured?
Really, we just sang the songs on the album. Every single song had all three of us in one capacity or another on it. So there were no songs where it was just one of us or just two of us. And we did a couple of our own songs, one each of our own songs in the show. And then pretty much the rest of it was the songs from the album.
Now, what about your touring schedule, Lucy? Do you tour pretty heavily over there?
Oh, over here? Yeah. Actually, I tour incredibly heavily. Lately, really, really heavily. I'm very busy. I certainly was even busier last year with Cry 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 on top of my own gigs. But yeah, I tour a lot.
Do you enjoy the touring process?
Yeah, I mean, the one hard thing about it, really, is that I'm married. So it's hard to be away from my husband. That's the one thing I don't like. Otherwise, I enjoy traveling. I always have. We traveled a lot when I was a kid. It's a great way to make a living.
Now, tell us about the folk scene in New York these days. Is there a real sense of history about it, harking back to the folk boom of the 60s?
I don't think there is much of a folk scene in New York anymore. At least I'm not aware of it, if it's there. There's a folk scene in Boston. There's a folk scene in Austin, Texas, where there are places that people hang out and there's a community. There really isn't so much of one in New York anymore. Once Folk City closed, it kind of scattered. People moved away. There really isn't a hub anymore. So that's really changed.
Well, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Now, through projects like Cry Cry Cry, it seems like there's a real healthy spirit of cooperation among singer-songwriters over there and not much in the way of competitiveness. Would that be a fair comment?
There's always competitiveness. I mean, people may not behave competitively, but believe me, everyone feels competitive because there's only a few slots in festivals. There's only room for so many people at record labels. I mean, it's competitive. But I think it's not cutthroat the way maybe it is in other areas of the music business. I think there is a community where people really are friends and try and help each other. And most of the people in the community are pretty nice. So, for instance, if a bunch of us are at a festival together, it's really fun, and it's really like we're pals.
Now, recording-wise, do you have any plans afoot for a new record this year?
Not this year. I am sort of in the process of beginning to think about making another album, and probably will put out an album sometime next year. But I've got a lot of planning to do and writing and stuff like that. And
do you have any thoughts ahead of what musical territory you'd be covering on the future recording?
Musical territory? Do you mean style?
Yeah, style-wise, yeah.
Oh, I'm sure it'll be consistent with with 10 Year Night. I mean, that's really who I am musically, and I imagine it'll be something along those lines.
You found a comfortable place there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that producer, that band, I love them. In fact, next week I'm doing a gig at the Bottom Line in New York, which is a pretty important club, with that band. There's 3 guitar players, so I only using one of the guitar players, Duke Levine, but actually, I'm sorry, the bass player is a different bass player. But anyway, the point is that I love making music with those guys, and it's my dream band, and so I would imagine that my next album will be along those lines.
Terrific, and we look forward to it. Okay, Lucy, look, thanks for your time. It's been a real treat catching up with you. Thank
you. Tell me again what this is for.
Well, basically, it's going to be a profile on your music and career to date. So
right, but in what?
On my program here, and it'll run for about an hour and a half.
Oh, it's a radio program.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew that.
Oh, well, you know now.
So in other words, this was a taped interview.
Yes, and we're going to put it to air. It'll be a profile on yourself. It'll run for about 90 minutes or so.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Well, I didn't realize it was for radio. I hope I was, appropriate.
Oh, no, excellent.
I guess next time I should ask. That's funny. I thought it was for a print interview.
No. It's all recorded.
Well, good. Well, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm really hoping to come down there. I don't have any plans to, but I know there's a festival that was interested in me, and I couldn't do it last year. I forget what festival it was. It was like in February or something, or March.
Would that be Port Fairy Folk Festival, I think?
That sounds right,
yeah. That's our biggest folk festival down here.
Well, I'd love to come down for that.
It's always the first weekend in March, it always is.
Yeah, that sounds right.
We'll keep our fingers crossed for next year, maybe.
Yeah, I should ask my agent about it and see if I can get into it. That would be great.
It's a great festival. Dar played here at that festival 2 years ago.
Say again?
Dar was here.
Did.
Yeah, she played it 2 years ago. It's a fantastic festival. Yeah, you'd fit in perfectly there.
Oh, I'd love to do it.
Well, okay, great. Lucy, thanks again.
Thank you so much.
We'll look forward to seeing you down here one day.
Great, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.